Your performance of Beowulf is legendary. I mean, everyone I know who has studied the poem knows of it, and people who are interested in seeing a really professional rendition of it can purchase the DVD that's in the description. I'll have the links for those in there. But I think a question that might come up is Beowulf as a poem has no sheet music. It has no notation of any kind of, so how can we begin to reconstruct its performance?
That's the basic question. I think that anyone who's interested in the performance of medieval epic has thought a lot about that and has been frustrated by, as you say, the lack of sheet music, which is an interesting term because it describes a problem that we have, which is that we expect written documents to represent performance situations. And in actual fact, it's the other way around. A written document is the last thing one would expect to find. And the performance would be something in the realm of oral tradition, which would have no document whatsoever other than the memories of those who experienced it. And I'm in looking at Beowulf, which I, of course, first knew as a text that I read along with everybody else. It was considered, when I was a student, it was considered British literature. And it's neither British nor is it literature. Unfortunately for those of us who studied so hard. And my involvement with medieval music generally brought me to another perspective about the performative arts and how music is perceived in other cultures. And that other culture could include our culture, which in its earlier times was very much different from what we know today. And so I was able to sort of, in my mind, walk back this text, I'll call it a text rather than a story, or certainly not a poem, into a place where it was not perceived in any other way than orally. And what kind of effect would that have had on its listeners, aside from the purely storytelling effect? And what kind of musical means would be called upon to express it? And how do we find out what those were and how they sounded? And there, the text itself gives us some hints. It describes performance situations in the actual society of the people who were participating in the story. So not the storyteller's society, but the society of the actors in the story. And in that we learn about this person called the Shop, who had a name very much like yours, actually. Maybe your name had something to do with Shop or Schöpfer at some point, which means creator and maker and the guy who puts things together. And the Shop is described at several points during the story as somebody who is commenting on what's going on around him. So he's kind of the commentator, the news reporter, the person who interprets what's going on to the rest of us and who gives it veracity and who gives it depth and who makes things official. He's also the person that knows the story of the people, the genealogies, the battles they won, the battles they lost, and he's the one who, in a way, carries the identity of a tribe or a tribal type people who have no written records. They have no written culture. They don't rely on books or parchment or anything to transmit who they are. It is transmitted through themselves. And in that case, the Shop becomes an incredibly important keystone in that transmission. And he becomes more important than a whole library. He's the embodiment of the memory of us, as an identifiable group of people. And so what kind of a music or what kind of a performance would come from such a person who would have had a training that stretched back into childhood? And the next step in that process for me was realizing that the musical instrument that he habitually plays, the harp, and it's called harp, not lyre, by the players at the time. Obviously is something that's very important for his function in society. So what is this instrument? What is it playing? And I don't think, based on the surviving uh, examples of this instrument that have been found in archaeological excavations, these instruments are not anything like the harp we know from folk music or from Irish or Neo-Celtic music. It is an instrument with very few strings, 6 strings usually. And so what kind of music can you make with 6 strings? If you hand that to a real harpist, they would say, you've got to be kidding. I can't begin to play music on this. There are no chords. There's not enough strings for me to play melodies. It doesn't even span an octave. And I can't do anything with this. It's not serious. And looking at the text of Beowulf and other texts, you see that it is serious. It's really a serious instrument. So what does it have that the harps that we know do not? Let's not look at it as for what it's deficient in. Let's look at it for what it's rich in. And what it's rich in is a certain kind of percussive character that lends itself to a certain kind of chanting. It lends itself to a certain kind of definition of what we call in medieval music the mode. So we're not dealing here with keys or with minor, major, and all of that. We're dealing here with the medieval modes, and modes are not scales. They are behavior patterns between tones and how they work together, and the identity that they create, the totality of the musical identity of certain tones used in certain ways. And that can be found in Gregorian chant. It can also be found in pagan music of the same period. And so combining the harp with this idea about modes brings us to, there must be some way to tune this instrument. And you've asked about this before. How does the tuning of the instrument inform what I do? And how do I get to decide about a tuning? There are no manuals surviving. There are no treatises aside from one small reference that describe how an instrument like this might be tuned. And I think the reason for that is that nobody thought to write any of that down because it was so obvious to them that it was tuned according to the way I learned from my father, or it was tuned according to the way I learned from my uncle, or the way that they always tuned it in my tribe. And that could vary from tribe to tribe. In other words, there is no systematic answer to that question. I think there are as many tunings as there were peoples playing such an instrument. And that's, if you look at a similar instrument, let's say I chose, for instance, a hybrid instrument from the 19th century, which is the 5-string banjo. If you look at the 5-string banjo in Appalachian culture in the United States, you find that there are well over 150 possible tunings that have been gathered by ethnomusicologists who traveled around to all the hollers and all the places that one can go and asked people to play the tunings of the instrument. It's highly variable according to what kind of music you're playing, for whom you're playing it, what's the context of the play, and who you learned it from, and what kind of people they were, and why they'd changed it for a certain kind of dance or a certain kind of ballad. There are all those variables. I think those variables existed in the Anglo-Saxon period as well, or Germanic poetry generally, all the way across Western and Northern Europe, and that these tunings, some were more popular than others, but there were a variety. And you can start to make tunings like that very easily. And it's really a simple kind of simply sounding process, which is you tune one note, and you make some kind of criterion for tuning that one note. You say, I'm tuning one note of this instrument, And how am I going to choose that note? There are two things you got to go by. One is, what will the string bear? How high up can you tune a string before it breaks? And how low can you tune a string before it stops sounding good? So you can take a relatively thick string and tune it up, and at a certain point it's going to break. And then you know that's my upper limit. Or you can tune it down to where it stops sounding attractive or coherent. And you can say, well, that's the lowest possible note. And that's a point of departure right there. And the other thing you want to think about when tuning the highest and or the lowest note is, how does this work with my voice, or the human voice generally? And when I say the human voice in this context, I mean a male voice in a setting of storytelling. So storytelling means it's got to go on for hours and hours and hours. It can't be the highest notes the human being can sing, tiring the voice after 30 minutes. It's got to be a register that is comfortable for telling a story. And so that begins to focus in on a range of 2 or 3 notes that are possible. And that's my lowest note. So that's a point of departure. And if I've tuned that one note, I haven't tuned it to anything else. And I've tuned 1 out of 6 strings. So I've tuned a large percentage of the whole instrument at that point. Then there is something else, which is, are these, you pose a very basic binary question. Are these instruments tuned randomly with no system? Or are they tuned systematically with some kind of system? And if so, what's that system? If you tune it randomly, okay, good luck. You tune any note you feel like, and it'll probably come out some kind of scale. Who knows? But it'll be based on the music that you know from before, and your brain will be feeding it all kinds of information. In other words, it will not be the same tuning as a chimpanzee would tune, because you have a musical background that the chimpanzee does not. Or it can be systematic. Now, if it's systematic, there's a lot we know. We know 2 things. We know about tradition, and we know about physics. And the physics of music are very clear, and they apply in all worlds. I think in other planetary systems, if we were to discover their music, we would find that they're based on the same things that our music's based on, and that is that certain kinds of intervals can be represented with numbers and measured according to numbers, and they measure things like the sound of the unison. If you tune one string to another string and it's in unison, that's 1-to-1. And it's very clear, and it's in every culture the same, and nobody doubts that the unison is the unison. So that's a given. That is a universal human element, and I think also on other planets we'll find it's true. If you then double that and say 1-to-2, you have the octave, because one string is twice as long as the other string, and that gives us the ratio of 1-to-2. And this musical system is ascribed to Pythagoras. So we're going way back, hundreds of years before Christianity even. But Pythagoras is the embodiment of this way of tuning. And now I'm going to fast forward through the rest because it's a little bit geeky. If you then have 1 and 1-to-1, you have 1-to-2, but then you have 2-to-3, which gives you the next most consonant interval in the Pythagorean system, which is the perfect fifth, which I think everybody hearing it would recognize it. Oh yeah, that's a great interval. It's very perfect. It's very harmonious. And 3-to-4 is the perfect fourth. And then after that, you get into some intervals where you can discuss how perfect they are. They tend to be perfectly imperfect or perfect or imperfectly perfect, but they're not the same as the big ones. 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 2-to-3, 3-to-4. If you take those intervals, the fourth, the fifth, the unison and the octave and apply them to the tuning of the instrument based on the strings that you have and what they will do and your own voice. So there's all these inputs coming from all sides. Everybody's screaming for attention. What I find you tend to get is a series of perfect fifths and fourths, sometimes the octave, and almost never the unison. Occasionally, then, intervals like the third, and occasionally intervals like a whole step, which is an interval represented by 9 to 8. It's pretty far out there, verging on dissonance. But what I have come up with over the years are a series of tunings that use these intervals. They give, if you play all the strings as a scale, they give the feeling of something we might call pentatonic, because it's missing the half step, it's missing the half tone, avoiding it altogether. So it just doesn't come up. And it has a very whole feeling to it, and it has a binary color feeling. It has a sort of primary color and a secondary color. And these can be expressed through perfect fourths or through perfect fifths. Now, I've just done an hour and a half worth of explaining in 2 minutes how I got to the tuning that I use for Beowulf, which is a series of 3 perfect fifths,
Mm-hmm.
based on a comfortable low tone that I can sing. And the high tone, which is an octave above that, is the highest tone I can sing. And I only save it for special moments. There are, however, other tunings, and I regularly use about 4 different tunings, including one that has come to us from a monk in the 9th century named Hucbald, who was a music teacher in a monastery. And like all good music teachers, he was always trying to find some new, cool way to teach music to the boys that they would pay attention and remember. And he had the idea to draw or visualize the harp lying on its side, so having the strings go this way, and thinking those strings are notes, and I will write the syllables of the Gregorian chant I want these kids to sing on the strings. And I'll move around from string to string as the notes change. And all they have to do is visualize the harp, and they can sing the chant. So it's a kind of notation we call tablature, which doesn't show notes, but it shows gestures. So Hucbald gives us in one of his treatises on teaching music to boys one of these tablatures for a chant that we happen to have the music for, and we know how it goes. And it shows a tuning which is a whole tone, a semitone, a whole tone, and a whole tone, which gives a scale. If you played it on the piano, it would be C, D, E, F, G, A.
Right.
Played forward. And it plays 2 perfect fifths and 3 perfect fourths. It's actually quite a cool tuning. But what we don't know is whether Hucbald was preempting the harp from its pagan background in order to have it as a tool for teaching music, or whether this was really the tuning that had been used by epic singers 200-300 years before Hucbald.
Right. And if viewers are kind of unfamiliar with the musical terminology, anyone who has listened to the sort of neo-pagan music is what I call it, like things like Yalder and the sort of like Old Norse Reconstruction music, they're
Yeah,
almost always tuned to that.
yeah,
So this
okay,
sort of do re mi fa sol la, I guess, is that
yeah,
is that how it is?
yeah. It would be do re mi fa sol la. Yeah,
Yeah, that's almost always how those harps are tuned. So I think that would
okay,
be a very familiar sound to people who
yeah,
are interested in that kind of music.
yeah. And it makes it also easier for harp players who are playing folk harps to just transport themselves from one instrument to the next, because they don't have to re-envision what they're doing around an instrument that has those gaps in it. I live with it all the time. For me, it's normal. But for a
Mhm.
real harpist, it's a challenge to make the transition, to avoid that
Well,
half step.
yeah, your tuning, I actually have like a mini Trossingen harp right here.
Okay.
It's very small.
Yeah,
But
that's okay. They found one that's about that size.
I actually did not know that. I thought this was
Yeah.
just an invention of the craftsman. That's pretty cool. I did not
Yeah,
know that.
it was found in an early Christian grave in a stone sepulchre found in a church in Cologne from
That's
the
awesome.
eighth century. So it's late Merovingian, early Carolingian, and it
I'll
has
have to
six
check that
strings.
out.
Yeah, and it's from the Church of Saint Severin,
Hmm.
Severinus, who's one of those Roman legionaries who converted to Christianity and was martyred by
Right.
his superior officer. Yeah,
Well, you mentioned Hucbald's notation, which had the harp like this,
yeah,
and then
exactly.
had the notes being notated on the strings like this, almost like a modern staff,
Yeah,
like modern sheet music.
except it's not the notes he wrote. He wrote the syllables of
The
the
syllables,
yeah,
right? Because he was like writing out the word, and he stretches it along sort of this line that notates where the note is supposed to go.
right.
Um,
And he wrote the syllable on it.
right. Um, and I think that that is really good evidence, along with stuff like the story of Cadman, that this was a rather accessible instrument to the everyday person. Would you agree with that? That
Um,
if
yes, if it was being used by Hookball to teach music, then it was certainly accessible.
Because he would have expected his students to know what a
Yeah.
harp looked like up close, that is,
Oh,
and
yeah.
know what the strings
He
sounded like.
he would have assumed that they knew that was
Hmm.
something from their experience. And we read from another monk's writings that he was frustrated teaching the Gospels to boys who didn't know Latin and to the older men who had been soldiers and had decided after a long military career to retire to the monastery. So these were men who probably couldn't read. And he wanted them to understand the gospel stories, but they didn't understand Latin. But he said they loved to get together at night and listen to stories of heroes and the great accomplishments and battles. Um, and he was frustrated by that. So he decided he would retell the Gospels as a hero story in German, in the language that his charges would understand, and it's only to be expected that the instrument would go with that. And he was
Right.
in a way co-opting the popular choice um, to get the job done,
Hmm.
which his job was to make sure they understood the gospel stories. And
Right.
he decorated them a little bit too. He made them even more interesting.
Mhm. I'm reminded of the extremely famous letter from Alcuin that I think everyone who has studied Beowulf in any capacity has at least heard of once or twice. That is when he got mad hearing that there were sort of legendary stories being told in the monastery, and he said, "Quid Ingeldus cum Christo?" That is like, what does Ingeld have to do with Jesus
Yes.
Christ? And continued to say that we should stop singing songs about these heathen lords that are, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
his words are pagan and damned. Not very
Yes,
kind
yes,
writing,
yes.
but it is evidence that these monks were singing their folk songs in the
Yes.
monastery.
Yeah, and that there was a competition going on. According to a monk like Hucbald, there's another one named Otfried in the Elsass. He thought that the story of the gospel was an even better story than any battle
Hmm.
story, and if they could only understand it the way he did, they would agree with him. And so he was shifting the mode of transmission into the thing that they liked, which was listening to a shop with a harp and his voice telling the story.
Right, and that's the same thing that we get with like Cadman's hymn, where he uses
Yeah,
these sort of formulae in a theological sense as opposed to
yeah,
their original meanings, which is
yeah,
pretty
yeah.
cool.
And
So
you can
when
tell that
you,
it must have been difficult because Cadman got spooked, when the lyre were coming his
yeah,
way. He had to excuse himself because he just was too shy to try.
Hmm.
So obviously there was a tradition there, and the other men in the round there, they knew what they were doing, and they were interesting. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall at that meeting.
Really, yeah,
Yeah.
honestly. Um, I then with your sort of learning of Beowulf, then you have to then put yourself in that environment. You have to imagine that it is an entirely oral performance. How did you learn the text and separate it from a bunch of words on a page into ideas in your mind and kind of
Yeah.
keep them there purely?
Well, it ruined one entire summer of my life, I would say, because somebody sprang it on me at the last minute. I was performing segments of Beowulf as part of another concert program with my ensemble. So I was performing the fight between Grendel and Beowulf as a set piece, as a thing by itself. And the director of a music festival in the Netherlands said, "Oh, the festival this year is about storytelling. Would you like to do a whole hour of Beowulf?" And I stupidly said yes. And that was in April, and the performance was scheduled for August. So I had to spend the whole summer working up, not 1,000 lines, but it was 852
Mm.
to the death of Grendel. And it nearly killed me. And I needed some prompts. I had a few prompts, and then over the subsequent years, I improved it, and I really finished the memorization process. But it took, 7, 8 years. I wasn't doing it full time. I was very busy with other projects at the time, so this was kind of my little thing on the side. But it did take up a lot of energy and time and concentration. And I'm not a genius at memorization like you are, so I it really was hard work.
What was your tactic? Would you just read a couple lines and then put your hand over the page and try to repeat them back until you had them?
Well, I was on several simultaneous tracks. One track was the sounds, because you can rely on the sounds to bring you the answers to what you're seeking with
Hmm.
the alliteration within the lines. So that was very helpful. And also, um, I would sometimes attach already very early in the process some kind of musical gesture to certain words or certain lines. And once those got cemented together, they were units. They were musical textual units. And that became much easier to memorize. So music does, or having a musical solution does give one um, an entry into the memorization that one doesn't have just with the text, because it's very intellectual. It's about what happened next and what he said and how he said it. And it's a lot of formulae, so maybe you get the same formula as you had 3 minutes ago, but it's tied up in a different way with the subsequent text, and you don't want to get derailed. So you have to know where you are at all times. So there's this conscious knowing where you are with the memory of sounds, just pure sounds, with the musical binding of the sounds with actual things that you're singing, if you're singing. And in my case, that was also the decision which was to be made about where to sing and where to not sing, and where to sort of sing and half sing, and where to sing with multiple notes and something approaching lyricism, and where to make crazy sounds that don't belong to singing at all. To use the whole spectrum of the human voice, from all the weird sounds that we're capable of making through speech, normal speech, intimate speech, semi-official speech, very official speech, speech which is verging on song. I'm thinking of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, where he's verging on music the whole time, into actual singing or chanting, and then from chanting into sort of lyrical singing, and then into things like multiple notes, melisma, or long notes, high notes, different things that we associate with singing today in lyrical arts. So there's a wide spectrum, and that there's a lot of choices to be made.
Mm. And I feel like when I am trying to recall lines, I often picture the page. And I've
Uh-huh.
tried as hard as possible to get away from that because I feel like that's an
Yeah,
unrealistic reconstruction of how the poet himself would have
yeah,
remembered it if he wasn't just creating it on the spot, which
yeah.
I probably personally doubt. Do you have any opinions on the sort of where we should stand in the spectrum of the oral formulaic poet, how much he was just inventing on the spot versus how much he had kind of prepared beforehand?
Well, I think with Beowulf, which is a written text, we have a kind of version of it. It probably pre-existed in other versions. For instance, in its pre-Christian manifestation, it certainly also existed, um, and it was modified as time went on. And at some point, quite late in its life, it was determined that this is worthy of being written because it's a good story and it's well crafted, and it had the Christian element introduced, although living side by side with certain pagan things. And it was deemed worthy of writing, and that's always the sort of last moment of the living tradition. When it gets written down, goodbye, it's finished. And that's when it starts for us. So we get it as a cadaver freshly dead.
Hmm.
I think that when you remember how it looked on the page, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's one part of the Beowulf story, I won't tell you which, every time I get to it, I used to take long walks to do memorizing. And I used to take, on my long walks, I would pass a certain gas station. And every time I come to a certain point in the text, a certain word or two trigger a memory of that gas station. I can't get rid of it. It's
Oh,
permanently.
I'm the same way. I can remember once I was driving to the rehearsal dinner of my own wedding, and my brother was driving. I wasn't driving, but
Nervous much?
I was just trying to think of something to calm my nerves. And
Yeah,
I was running through a part of the poem that was rather shaky for me, so I had to pull it up and kind of almost relearn it. And now every time that I go through that section, I think it's specifically the part where Beowulf hears about Grendel. So thá from Hamjafrein, Hylakestein, Grenlas
Hilakstein,
Dada,
Grandestede.
Gold Mediatum Grenlas Dada. Yeah, he every time I say those couple lines, I think of the stretch of the highway that we were on when I was reading it. It's crazy how the human brain
Yeah.
works.
And now the next time I perform it, when I get to that spot, I'll think about you telling me about that.
Yeah. Um, so
That's
what,
true oral tradition there. There you got it.
yeah. Having spent a long period of your life with this poem, what do you think you can tell us about sort of the artistic character of the Beowulf poet? Do you think you could say a bit what he was like?
Well, first of all, I wonder if there was a he,
Yeah?
and it wasn't a them. And here I don't mean politically correct. I mean multiple people. Um, it just could be that we're dealing with something that various men worked on over various periods of time, quite separate from one another. It might have been an ancient poem already in the ninth century.
Hmm.
And by the time it was written in the early 11th century, it could have been really a monument to culture that nobody really understands anymore, which might explain some of the mistakes and the copying errors and the
Hmm.
problems that the scribes had with figuring out what they were doing.
Yeah, I
Because
think the current consensus would be that it's probably the manuscript that we have from the 11th century is probably a copy of a 8th century Mercian text that has a lot of
yeah,
vocabulary that the scribes just didn't know, and that's why they
They
made
didn't
so
know it,
many
so they were
mistakes.
faulty in writing it down. Yeah. So
Mhm.
your question is about the artistic personality, and I think there were multiple artists at work, but I think they were all inspired by the story and all inspired by the craft that goes into making alliterative verse.
Mhm.
And every time I work on it, I find something new that's just astonishing, and or something that's cleverly done more than I had originally noticed. I'm always discovering things, and that's after all these years.
So, what then would you say about the sort of artistic character of the poem itself, then, or perhaps the culture which produced it?
I think it's obviously from a very high culture. I don't think this is a story recited in front of a carousing bunch of drunken warriors. I think that the audience for this poem, the way we have it now, was certainly appreciated by literati and people who really knew the old ways of, probably Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and could appreciate it and weren't necessarily so interested in the story itself as the morals that come from the story and the things the story is trying to teach us about being seeking glory and seeking strength and not being afraid and throwing away the weapons and trusting in oneself. And, as Beowulf says before the battle, he trusted his own might and also a little help from God. So it's a nice mixture. And I think that to me it seems more aristocratic and that they were possibly very nostalgic for their homeland, their ancient homeland across the sea. And this was a way to connect with that. Just as some American colonists in the 18th century and then in the 19th century after the independence had a kind of nostalgia for the good old days of jolly old England and the way things used to be. I think that nostalgia still exists and it can be expressed through this kind of a poem. So
Yeah,
I
I
don't think it was actually listened to by warriors any longer at that point, or maybe a couple of old men who had been warriors at some point. But I think it was more nostalgic and more reflective and more looking backwards rather than looking forwards.
mhm. You mentioned Beowulf being classified as British literature,
Yeah.
and there's a talking point that the Professor Tom Shippey, the famous Tolkienist, and also he's a old English scholar in his own right. He often will talk about the relationship between Beowulf and English nationalism, and mention that there's a bit of a problem there in that while Beowulf has been attempted to be kind of presented as the English epic, like the English national epic,
Yes. Yeah.
it's it's not about England.
Yeah.
It doesn't take place in England,
Yeah. Yeah.
and England actually is not even mentioned in the entire
No,
poem.
nothing.
Uh,
Yep.
the, the only potential link is the character Hengist,
Right.
mentioned in the Finnsburg saga. But
Yes.
it's not said that he migrates to England at the end of
No,
the
no, no.
saga. No, he's just mentioned, and he's not mentioned in a particularly good light either.
No.
He's
Yeah. Yeah.
and then
The Finnsburg story. Yeah. It has more to do with Frisia than it does with England.
for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. And you mentioned this kind of nostalgia for the homeland. I think it's really interesting that you brought up the English, the early Americans, because I'm not sure if you've ever heard this before, but Thomas Jefferson actually wanted Hengist and Horsa to be on the seal of the United States.
Oh.
When they were discussing the ideas, he put forth a proposition that had Hengist and Horsa on it, which is so interesting because that's part of the English migratory tradition,
Yes.
not at all the American.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's the
Strange.
nostalgia that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And it gives a kind of gravitas to the feeling of who we are, that we didn't just come from nowhere, that we're from someplace even more glorious, and we're carrying on the tradition of glory in our own way, but we have
Mhm.
glorious ancestors.
Right. Do you have, I'm sure it changes. Is there a part of the poem that you kind of enjoy most to perform?
Oh, well, yes. The part I enjoyed performing, I don't really do it much anymore because people have asked me to cut it down in time. Because
Mhm.
my performance of the whole thing up to line 1050, 106, 1060, something like that. It's at the end of the celebrations after Grendel's defeat.
Right.
And there's a kind of party scene there, which starts with the guys riding their horses up and down and rejoicing that Grendel's dead, and then um, speeches. Everybody's making a speech. Hrothgar makes another long, weary speech, and Beowulf makes a speech about how he couldn't, unfortunately, bring him the whole dead monster, but only this arm. But it
Ooh,
shows
the
at
each
least,
Swede or yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then there's a little. Then the shop is singing, and we have a little diversion into the shop's story of Sigurd and the dragon, and then it careens back to the scene with everybody together and the gifts being given, including a gold being given for the man who was eaten by Grendel. And then it ends with the shop saying that God always took care of us as he still does today.
Hmm.
And that's how that, for me, that's where the first part ends, or the first two parts. First part, because the next part is going to be Grendel's mother. So that part, which is very fast moving and cinematographic, it's cutting all the time from scene to scene. You've had this long, long single take thing, which is the fight, and it's very gripping, and it just doesn't end, and it doesn't end, and it doesn't end, and then it's over, and then comes tack, 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 tack. Very choppy celebration scene. I used to love performing that because it's, first of all, everybody's relieved. This is over. The battle's done. We won. And now what's going to happen? And everybody's trying to get a word in edgewise. So it's like a bunch of overstimulated boys all trying to talk at once and bragging and riding horses. And I think that that's just fun to perform. It's also a relief, and everybody's always saying, "Aren't you tired? Aren't you exhausted?" And you think, "No, you get energized by a section like that."
I
That's
love
a favorite.
seeing, yeah, I love seeing the kind of energy that you bring to the I guess the more violent scenes. I think the first time that I really decided that I wanted to memorize, large chunks of Beowulf at least, was after seeing a clip of your performance of when Grendel invades the hall the first
Yeah,
time,
yeah,
and the kind of character that you assumed on Rasta Nom 3 Tithena on an
uh-huh.
FDY, that kind of like when he comes in and steals 30 thanes and eats them essentially, which
Yeah,
is a pretty metal line, and I think the kind of what is the right word for this, vitriol maybe,
yeah,
that you kind of brought to that was really inspiring,
yeah.
and I
Well, he
wanted
was a lot of anger in that boy.
to.
A lot of
Yeah,
anger.
I wanted to be able to perform that for my friends. So I was actually
Okay.
just hanging around. A couple of my friends were studying, and I walked into the room and just sort of did it in front of them. That line, and they all thought that I lost it. But it was so
Oh,
fun, and
somebody
I
call
think
a doctor. Yeah.
every time that I perform the poem, I think that is the part where I'm most copying you.
Uh-huh.
Is that part? Is it more kind of fun to do like the more violent parts, or have you gotten tired of it?
Um, Sometimes that particular part I love doing myself because I love the way that scene is crafted. the way it comes from a little happiness at the beginning, and they're all having a great time, and then everything was happy until, and then we get någon kan föra fram en femton heller. Then
Hmm.
there came one guy, a fiend from hell, and his name was Grendel. And as soon as his name is said, we're in a different world.
Right.
That's a lot of fun to perform. And I just channel his anger basically.
Hmm. It really reminds me of Tolkien's defense of the poem in 1936,
Yeah,
in the Monsters and Critics essay, when he kind of defends the fact that there was this criticism that the important parts of the poem were all kind of on the outside, and that the unimportant parts took up the majority. And I think his defense of just like, fighting against monsters is cool. It's cool
yeah,
to fight to fight
yeah,
Grendel
yeah,
and a dragon. And I do get the sense, especially after watching your performances, that the poet would have cared about that part. That was the
yeah.
entertaining
Oh,
part
sure.
that actually
Oh,
got
yeah.
people's attentions.
Yeah. Well, who doesn't like a good monster breaking in and eating humans? I have you mentioned Tolkien. The biggest compliment I ever received was from an elderly lady who had been a student of Tolkien's at Oxford back in the 50s. And she came to one of my performances, and she was very conservative and not given to overly being interested in these things like performance. But she told me that my performance reminded her of old Tolkien reciting Beowulf in class, and I was very flattered by that. To think that
Yeah,
there's some kind of a connection there.
right. I've also heard accounts of he would begin his lectures. I'm not sure how true this is, or if this is just sort of what's the word, like a myth surrounding Tolkien.
Yeah.
But I've heard that he would come into the lectures on day one, drop the books on the desk, and then just start reciting Beowulf at the students in Old English,
Yeah.
in a sort of almost like an angry way, which would, of
Good for
course,
him.
grab their attentions. And I was very inspired by that, and I was in the process of learning the poem and memorizing it, and I was TAing a course on Tolkien,
Yeah.
and we had a couple weeks dedicated to Beowulf studies, and I thought it would be a good idea to imitate that. So I came in one day, and my professor had set up like the translation on the board before class so that they would be able to read what I'm
Okay.
saying. And
Mm.
I slammed the books on the desk and I started reciting. And actually, I feel quite bad about it because you didn't think about this, but I didn't think about this. You can't just walk into a room full of people and start shouting at them.
I
And
thought you were mad.
we actually had one of the poor students actually mentioned afterwards that if we were going to do any sort of like unwarned attacks at their ears, that we do have to say something beforehand, because there are some people that can't really handle just getting shouted at
Wow. Okay.
in another
Trigger warning.
language.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel bad because it is a valid concern, but
Yeah.
it was a pretty embarrassing moment for us.
Sure. Of course. Uh, well, you're lucky that's all that happened.
Maybe. Okay, a lot about Beowulf. I do want to talk briefly about Boethius as well, who's
Sure.
another one of my favorite artists that or if I can call him an artist, I think I can, that you've done work with. He's a lot different. The Constellation of Philosophy, at least I figure for Sequentia, is a lot different,
Yeah.
in that a lot of the medieval manuscripts actually have musical notation.
Yes.
And I read that you and your group Sequentia studied this with Sam Barrett of Cambridge,
Right. Yes.
and to perform the Metra. Was this a lot easier than Beowulf? Were there added challenges with the musical notation,
Um,
or what?
different kind of challenges. Let's just say that it required different artistic inputs from us, um, because the singers worked directly with Sam in making transcriptions, some of which could be accurately done, and with fair amount of certainty the tones were known, and others you just knew that there are two tones going down and three tones going up, and we're in G mode, and then you would have to look at G mode hymns from the same period or other kinds of pieces in similar metrics to make a reconstruction. So it was much more fine tuning and mechanical work than with Beowulf, where it's much more you have a tuning system and you have the voice and you have a story to tell. And the texts are of course much shorter in the Consolatio. And we had, however, the same instruments, but different tunings,
Hmm.
and also different kinds of harps. We had a real harp and also the six-string harp, because at this point, the time of the manuscripts was basically late 10th to early 12th century, when there was this fashion in the monastic world of singing the metra from the Consolatio. And if the Consolatio dates from the time of Boethius's imprisonment, so that's the early 6th century,
Hmm.
we have no musical traces of it before I think, the 9th century. So what was happening in those intervening 6 centuries? Possibly it disappeared from view, or it remained an oral tradition, or there's a lost manuscript that is the kind of key to the whole thing. But basically, the fashion of making these songs started up in the 9th century and was really very strong in the late 10th, early 11th centuries, and then tapered off in the 12th century, and was used to teach boys in monastic schools, to teach them Latin, to teach them rhetoric, to teach them music, and hopefully to teach them also the accompaniment of music with the harp or other instruments. And its primary source that we used for our reconstructions is a manuscript now in Cambridge, which is called the Cambridge Songs.
Mm.
So it dates from roughly the same time as the Beowulf manuscript, but it was copied in Canterbury. And it contains a repertoire of well over 80 songs in Latin and some in German. And it's certainly a copy of a lost original, which probably was German. It probably came from the Rhineland. And these songs are heavily invested in Boethius, but also there are very many songs about music and the art of music. And this Pythagoras that I mentioned earlier, he comes up several times. And the
That guy.
concept of musica. So the musica is one of the 7 liberal arts, and she is the one who determines the musical arts, which is all rhythm and all mode and everything about how song is made in its theoretical zone. So in the Pythagorean world of intervals, that's musica. It's a science. It's not the same thing as performance.
Mm.
Excuse me. So that the a musicus, or a person who is given that designation, is a scientist on a par with an arithmetic expert or a physicist or anybody dealing with geometry or with astronomy, which were the other of the 4 liberal arts in the quadrivium.
Mhm.
So we're in a different world. We're in a world of monastic learnedness, not in a world of storytelling necessarily. And these songs, we have nowhere any kind of description of why they were sung, but they're in so many manuscripts that they were obviously widespread, and they're beautiful poems. Anybody who's read the Consolation of Philosophy comes away with a huge respect for Boethius as a craftsman of poetry. And you asked me once about the one I like the best, and it's the poem that tells the story of Orpheus and his trip to the underworld to free his wife who had been bitten by a snake and was taken away from him on their wedding day. And he gets her back, but then he loses her again as they're climbing towards the light because he looks back when he'd been told not to do that. And it's a lesson that you have to keep your eyes forward and you have to keep your eyes focused on the goal and not look back. That's it's the 12th verse of the 12th song in the third book.
Okay.
It's a beautiful, beautiful song. Very complex, very long lines, and it's set to music in several sources, sometimes different melodies. There doesn't seem to have been one accepted melody.
Mhm. So I do want to ask about the instrumentation. All of Sequentia's recordings of the meters of Boethius can be found on Spotify. I'll have the link to that in the description as well. I think my favorite of the recordings is probably also my favorite poem from the Consolatio. That is O Stelli Feri Conditor.
Yeah,
It's just a beautiful poem.
it is.
In
Yeah,
that, you are singing accompanied by a flute. Is it a
yes.
flute?
Flute, yes.
Accompanied by a
Wooden.
flute which seems to be following at times its own melody, and then at times it's following you on like a
Yeah.
fifth. Um, is that notated, or is it just the
No,
singer notated?
no,
No, okay.
just the singer. There's nothing notated for the instruments in the manuscripts. It's just the vocal melody, and in certain cases, it's not even 100% sure that we've transcribed it correctly because
Mhm,
it's just some little things we call neumes, which are drawn in. The text is written out, and then above the text are some little scratches that were lifted from the art of writing Gregorian chant
mhm,
in the ninth and 10th centuries. And it describes movements of two, three notes, sometimes four, upwards, downwards, or turning around and coming back, or different movements of notes. And the flute player is then first has to sort of absorb the melody completely and be able to play that completely freely. And then he figures out where he can deviate and play in a harmony that would be also typical for that time,
mhm.
using again those Pythagorean intervals, the fourth, the fifth, the major second, and the unison and the octave. The flute would have been one of the main melodic instruments. The harp is sometimes a melodic instrument, sometimes an accompanying instrument. And probably towards the end of the 11th century, you would have just beginning the fiddle, what we call vielle, so a bowed string instrument, but that made its entrance into the European scene rather late. But you wouldn't find yet the lute, for instance. You might find something called kitara, which is a plucked stringed instrument with a fingerboard. So the principle is the same as the guitar, but no frets, and probably only three strings.
And that's the word that Bede uses to describe Cadman's harp, if I'm not mistaken, kitara.
Yeah, well, this is the problem with names for musical instruments in the Middle Ages. They're always,
Nebulous.
They're lifted from Psalm 150, and so you get a lot of psalterium, kitara, and the name for the and lyra and fistula, but you get a lot of names not like um, the Germanic name harpa, which is not one of those Latin names. I mean, it got adopted finally as a Latin-based word, but it's a German word.
Hmm.
Harpa or herpo or herpan, it
Hmm.
depends on the language, but it's definitely not from Latin. Doesn't mean the Romans didn't know it when they were an occupying army for a long time, and plenty of them decided to stay. So the intermixture of Roman culture and indigenous culture we'll never know.
Hmm. I think I have one final question as we're coming up on
Okay.
time. Um, what advice do you think you would give to young scholars or students of medieval music who are really excited about this stuff and would like to kind of follow in your footsteps and
Hmm.
become a kind of great medieval musical scholar or performer.
Well, there are two things. One, if you want to become a scholar, there's no better time than now because there's so many things have been investigated. The amount of doctoral dissertations that have come out in the last 30 years is just overwhelming. Nobody can keep up anymore with what's being written. Um, Whereas when I was starting out, it was manageable, but now it's just totally not manageable. But for somebody who's really ambitious and likes to read and study and think, there are so many interesting projects going on, and almost every known manuscript of medieval music has been thoroughly studied. It's a little bit of a problem for dissertation topics these days in that it's hard to find a topic that hasn't already been taken
Right.
by somebody. It's really hard. So we're starting to get these really arcane dissertations about 2 pages in a torn leaf from the 15th century. We're creeping more and more into the later Middle Ages because the really interesting time, which was the High Middle Ages, the 12th and 13th centuries, has basically been done. It's just everybody's been there multiple times. And so when new trends come along, like gender studies come along, and we do everything again, but from a gender perspective, that adds another layer to the cake, and it becomes more and more complex. So it's a great time to be a scholar. But my advice to scholars would be learn Latin first. Don't try to learn it later. Do it first off. Get it done in high school because it'll serve you so well later on to have done Latin first and not wait. It also opens up many more sources to you as a reader. Now, if you're interested in performing, that the thing I would advise is to have the scholarly background, to know how to read a manuscript, to know how to interpret what you're seeing, and not to rely on transcriptions, because musical transcriptions are inevitably made by people who have editors clamoring for something they can sell. And that's, or if you're selling it yourself online, you have to make it attractive, which means you have to dumb it down a little bit to people who maybe don't know or don't care that much. They're just marginally interested, and so you get a lot of editions, so-called editions of music, which are making decisions for you about the tempo, about where you sing it, about the way it's articulated, about how the text works with the music. All these things are no longer left up to you, but they're decided for you in the editions, and you have to be capable of doing it all yourself, which means getting down and dirty with the manuscripts. There's nothing beats it. And most manuscripts these days are available in excellent quality digital reproductions online. It's really no longer an excuse to say the microfilm was so dirty I couldn't tell if that was a note or a fly speck. We really have almost everything in high quality, and that's changed the game a lot. So, and then once you have made such a decision to be a performer, it's a big decision, because it's not an easy world to get involved with, because there's not a lot of demand for it. People tend to follow the same little narrow path, which is the same 20 songs that everybody knows, which ring all the right bells. And it would be important to really discover something that hasn't been done yet, and to really get involved with it seriously, not presenting it as a charming excursion into a museum, but as something where a human being is expressing something in song and trying to express the inexpressible with music. And trying to bring that to today's audience is not that hard because people are hungry for something real. They're hungry for a real human experience. Sometimes they think medieval music is charming, and it's something like a friend of ours calls this aesthetic movement drums and fun. It's the Renaissance fair idea. The Middle Ages is dressing up in costumes and performing delicate, harmless little songs on charming instruments. That's a 19th century idea that got turbocharged in the 20th century. But if you really want to get involved with this music seriously, you need to scratch away all that stuff and get to the basis of what's being performed, which is the text, and understand the language and the text that you're performing in. And then the music, you have to see what's in the manuscript and how does that fit with the text and how does it express a poem, which expresses a human point of view or a human desire or a human frustration or whatever. And keep that honest. But keeping honesty is really hard today because people feel under pressure to entertain. And I think that we're all entertained to death. I mean, we're, as a friend of mine calls it, prisoners of fun. There's so much fun, and the medieval fun is easy to produce. It's quickly done. But the true essence of medieval music is hard work, but when you find it, there's nothing like it.
Hmm.
Like a song like O Stelliferi, of Boethius, the one you were talking about. There's no way you can present that as a little simple song. It is by its nature something very heavy and very deep, and it's every bit as heavy and deep as a late Beethoven string quartet. And nobody ever pretended to play late Beethoven as fun. It is what it is, and sometimes we just need to recognize a lot of this music that survived from the Middle Ages is extremely important and serious and talks about eternal human issues.
All
There,
right.
end of sermon.
Wow.
End of sermon.
Yeah. Benjamin Bagby, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
My pleasure.
Hey, thanks for watching that interview. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you like content like this, be sure to check out the rest of the channel and kindly consider becoming a supporter on Patreon or subscribing. Until next time, Farathiye Yesunde.